Greta Hoffmann had not expected to survive the capture. When the British soldiers found her unit hiding in the collapsed remains of a field hospital outside Tobruk, she had pressed herself against the concrete wall and waited for the shots that would end everything cleanly. Instead, they ordered her out with gestures and shouted commands she barely understood, their rifles trained on her chest, but their fingers loose on the triggers. She emerged with her hands raised, blinking in the North African sun, and saw the other women from her medical corps already lined up in the courtyard, their faces streaked with dust and resignation. The journey across the ocean had taken weeks. First the trucks to the coast, then the holding facility in Casablanca, where she slept on cement floors and ate thin soup from tin bowls. The other prisoners were nurses, radio operators, clerks, women who had been pulled from various units as the Africa Corps collapsed. They did not speak much to each other during those months. Fear kept them silent. Fear and exhaustion, and the numbing certainty that whatever came next would be worse than what they had already endured. Greta heard stories whispered in the dark, tales of camps in the Soviet territories where prisoners were worked until they dropped, where rations were cut to starvation levels and bodies were stacked like cordwood in the frozen ground. She heard about reprisals, about revenge, about the ways captors could make prisoners pay for the sins of their countries. When they were finally loaded onto a transport ship, Greta stood on the deck and watched the African coast recede into the haze. The sea was enormous and indifferent, stretching in every direction until the horizon became a thin line between water and sky. She had never seen the ocean before the war. Now it would carry her to a continent she knew only from maps, to a fate determined by men whose language she could not speak. The crossing was rough. The ship rolled and pitched in heavy swells, and many of the women became violently ill, retching into buckets or over the railings. Greta managed to keep her food down, though her stomach churned constantly, and her head ached from the diesel fumes that permeated the lower decks where they were housed. They were given 2 meals a day, bread and a watery stew, and allowed on deck for 1 hour each afternoon under guard. The sailors mostly ignored them, going about their duties with the practiced efficiency of men who had made this voyage many times before. At night, Greta lay in her bunk and listened to the ocean grinding against the hull. The woman in the bunk beside her, a radio operator named Margaret, cried quietly into her thin blanket. Others prayed, their whispered words barely audible over the constant thrum of the engines. Greta did not pray. She had stopped praying somewhere in the desert when the shells were falling so close she could feel the percussion in her bones, and the wounded kept arriving faster than she could treat them. God, if he existed, was not listening to German women anymore. Perhaps he had never been listening at all. The ship docked in New York, though Greta did not see the city. They were transferred directly from the vessel to a train, the windows covered with mesh screens that allowed air but blocked any clear view. The train travelled for days, stopping occasionally at sidings where guards would bring food and water and escort the women to latrines set up in converted freight cars. Greta watched the landscape change through the mesh, the dense buildings giving way to smaller towns, then to farmland that stretched flat and endless in every direction. The vastness of it unsettled her. Germany was small and crowded, every metre of land accounted for and utilised. Here, the emptiness seemed to go on forever, broken only by occasional farmhouses or grain elevators rising like monuments to some incomprehensible plenty. When the train finally stopped and the doors were opened, Greta stepped down onto a wooden platform and felt the heat of the American summer hit her like a physical force. The air was thick and humid, smelling of diesel and hot metal and something else, something green and growing that she could not identify. A line of military trucks waited on a dirt road beyond the platform, their canvas covers flapping in the breeze. The guards directed the women toward the trucks, their voices firm but not unkind. Greta climbed into the back of one vehicle and sat on a hard bench, her small bundle of possessions clutched in her lap. She owned nothing except the clothes she wore and a single change of undergarments she had been issued in Casablanca. The camp appeared gradually through the dust kicked up by the convoy. First, the perimeter fence, tall and topped with wire, but not the razor wire she had expected. Then the guard towers, manned but somehow less menacing than she had imagined. And finally, the buildings themselves, long wooden barracks painted a pale green, arranged in neat rows with gravel paths between them. The truck stopped in front of a larger building near the entrance, and the women were ordered out. They formed a ragged line, waiting. Greta's legs ached from the long journey. Her skin felt grimy, layered with sweat and travel dust. She wanted water, a place to sit, a moment to close her eyes. Instead, she stood and waited, watching as guards moved between the buildings with a casual efficiency that suggested routine rather than urgency. One of them was smoking a cigarette, the smoke drifting lazily in the still air. Another was laughing with a colleague, their voices carrying across the compound. Greta could not reconcile these images with the stories she had heard, with the expectations she had carried across the ocean. When her turn came to enter the processing building, she stepped into a space that smelled of disinfectant and fresh paint. The walls were clean, the floor swept. Light streamed through windows that were not barred, falling in bright rectangles across the wooden boards. A sergeant sat behind a table, a clipboard in front of him, a stack of folded clothing to his right. He looked up as Greta approached, his eyes meeting hers without hostility or contempt, just a mild professional attention that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. He said something in English, then gestured to another soldier who held up a small card and pointed to the German text printed on one side. Greta took the card. Her hands were shaking slightly, though whether from exhaustion or something else she could not say. The German was printed in clear, precise letters. You will receive 80 cents per day for work performed. Wages paid monthly. Canteen purchases permitted with earned credits. She read the words 3 times, certain she was misunderstanding. Wages, 80 cents per day. She looked up at the sergeant, wanting to ask if this was some kind of trick, some cruel joke designed to raise hopes before crushing them. But he had already moved on to the next item, sliding a towel across the table toward her, then a bar of soap still wrapped in paper, then the folded set of clothing. He spoke again, his tone matter-of-fact, and gestured toward a doorway at the back of the room. The clothing was clean. Not new, but clean and mended, smelling faintly of laundry soap. Greta held the bundle against her chest and followed the other women through the doorway into a smaller room where they were directed to undress. A female officer stood to one side, watching but not staring, her expression neutral. Greta removed her travel-stained clothes and stood naked in the afternoon light, acutely aware of how thin she had become, how her ribs showed beneath her skin. The officer said something and pointed to a row of showers at the far end of the room. Greta walked across the concrete floor, her bare feet leaving faint prints in the dust that had travelled with her. The water was warm. Not hot, but warm enough to shock her after months of cold water or no water at all. Greta stood under the stream and felt the accumulated dirt and sweat and fear begin to dissolve, running down her body in grey rivulets. She used the soap, working it into a lather, scrubbing her skin until it was pink and raw. She washed her hair, short as it was, working her fingers through the tangles. The water seemed endless, a luxury so profound it made her dizzy. In Casablanca they had been given a bucket each week, 5 women sharing, the water already grey by the time it reached her turn. When she finally shut off the valve and stood dripping on the concrete, the female officer handed her a towel. It was rough but clean and large enough to wrap around her entire body. Greta dried herself slowly, savouring the simple pleasure of being clean. She dressed in the issued clothing, trousers that were slightly too large and a shirt that hung loose on her shoulders. There were socks, grey and thick, and shoes that laced up the front. Everything fit well enough. Everything was clean. The barracks was long and narrow, divided into 2 rows of cots with a central aisle between them. Each cot had a thin mattress, a pillow, a folded blanket. The walls were wood, the ceiling exposed beams. Windows ran along both sides, propped open to let in the breeze. The floor was swept clean, and the air smelled of pine and sawdust and something else, something that reminded Greta of the mountains before the war, of places that were whole and untouched. She found the cot that had been assigned to her, a metal tag with a number matching the one on her card hanging from the frame. She set her bundle down and sat, the mattress giving slightly under her weight. It was stuffed with something that felt like straw, but clean straw, fresh straw. She ran her hand over the blanket, grey wool, military issue, but thick enough to provide real warmth. Across the aisle, a woman with short dark hair was doing the same thing, her fingers tracing the weave as though she could not quite believe it was real. Greta lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling. She tried to summon the fear that had been her constant companion for months, the certainty that each moment of relative comfort was merely a prelude to something worse. But the fear would not come. In its place was only exhaustion and a strange, tentative confusion. The card in her pocket said wages. The soap had been real. The water had been warm. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, falling into darkness so quickly and so completely that she did not even dream. The sound of a bell woke her. Greta sat up, disoriented, not sure where she was or how long she had slept. The light coming through the windows was golden, late afternoon, fading toward evening. Other women were rising from their cots, stretching, speaking to each other in low voices. A guard stood at the entrance to the barracks, not shouting, just waiting. Greta stood and followed the others outside. They were led to a mess hall, another long building with rows of tables and benches. The smell of cooking food hit Greta so hard she stopped walking, her stomach clenching with sudden, desperate hunger. It had been years since she had smelled anything like this, meat and bread and something rich and savoury that made her mouth water. The women filed through a line, each receiving a tray and utensils, then moving past a series of stations where food was served onto their plates. Greta watched the woman ahead of her receive a piece of chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, a slice of bread with butter. When her turn came, the server, a young man in an apron, scooped the same portions onto her plate without hesitation, without reducing the amount, without any sign that she was somehow less deserving of food than anyone else. She carried her tray to a table and sat. Around her, women were eating quickly, mechanically, the way prisoners eat when they do not know if the food will be taken away or when the next meal will come. Greta forced herself to eat slowly, to chew each bite, to let her stomach adjust to the sudden abundance. The chicken was real, not boiled organ meat or gristle. The potatoes were smooth and buttery. The bread was soft, still warm from the oven. She ate everything on her plate, then sat with her hands folded, feeling the food settle in her belly, heavy and foreign and impossibly good. That night, lying on her cot with the blanket pulled up to her chin, Greta listened to the sounds of the barracks settling. Women coughed, shifted, whispered to each other in the dark. Someone was crying quietly, the sound muffled by a pillow. Someone else was breathing with the deep, regular rhythm of genuine sleep. Greta stared at the ceiling beams and tried to understand what kind of place this was. The stories she had heard did not match what she was experiencing. The fear she had carried did not fit with the warm water, the clean clothes, the chicken and bread. She wondered if this was temporary, if the real treatment would begin tomorrow or next week, or whenever the people in charge decided the performance of decency had gone on long enough. She wondered if she was a fool for allowing herself to feel anything other than constant vigilance. But the card in her pocket said wages. That word stayed with her, sharp and specific. Wages implied work, yes, but also compensation. It implied a transaction between two parties, each with something the other needed. It implied that her labour had value, that she was not simply being used and discarded, but participating in something that recognised her as more than just a body to be exploited. She had never expected that. She had never imagined it was possible for a prisoner to be treated this way. Sleep came eventually, pulling her down into darkness that was blessedly empty of dreams. The morning bell woke them at 6 a.m. Greta rose with the others, dressed quickly, and followed the line to the latrines, modern toilets in a building that smelled of harsh cleaner but not filth. There were sinks with running water, mirrors spotted with age but intact. She washed her face and hands, drying them on the same towel from yesterday. Back in the barracks, she made her bed according to the example set by a woman who seemed to know the routine, folding the blanket in precise thirds, smoothing the pillow. Then it was back to the mess hall for breakfast, oatmeal with brown sugar and milk, toast with jam, coffee that was bitter but hot and strong. After breakfast, the women assembled in the yard outside the barracks. A guard with a clipboard began calling names, dividing them into groups. When Greta's name was called, she stepped forward with 11 other women. The guard gestured for them to follow, and he led them across the compound to a building she had not noticed the day before, long and low with steam rising from vents on the roof. Inside, the air was warm and humid. Rows of deep sinks ran along both walls, and in the center of the room stood large metal machines that Greta recognized as mangles, devices for pressing water out of wet fabric. A woman in a neat uniform stood near the entrance, her grey hair pinned back, her expression neither kind nor cruel, simply businesslike. She spoke in English, and another woman, younger, translated into German with an accent that suggested she was from Bavaria or perhaps Austria. The supervisor, as the translator called her, demonstrated how to sort the laundry. Whites in one bin, colours in another, heavily soiled items in a third. She showed them how to measure the soap powder, how to adjust the water temperature, how to feed the wet linens through the mangle rollers without catching their fingers. The work was simple enough, repetitive and physical. Greta had done worse. She had hauled wounded soldiers through mud and blood. She had scrubbed surgical instruments with sand when water was scarce. Laundry was nothing. She worked steadily, her hands quickly becoming red and raw from the hot water and the harsh soap. Her back began to ache from the constant bending and lifting, but the pain was manageable, almost welcome in its familiarity. Pain meant work, and work meant purpose, and purpose meant she was still alive in some meaningful way. Around her, the other women worked in silence, their movements gradually synchronizing into a rhythm. The supervisor walked between the rows, observing, occasionally adjusting someone's technique with a gesture or a word translated by the younger woman. At noon, the supervisor raised her hand and spoke. The translator relayed the message: break for lunch. They were to stop what they were doing, wash their hands, and wait. Greta did as instructed, scrubbing her reddened hands under cold water until they were clean. A few minutes later, another woman entered, carrying a large tray loaded with sandwiches and a metal pitcher. She set it on a table near the door, and the supervisor gestured for the workers to come forward. The sandwiches were simple but substantial, thick slices of white bread with cheese and thin slices of ham. There were enamel cups for the coffee, which was poured from the pitcher and tasted bitter but strong enough to cut through the exhaustion. Greta took her sandwich and cup and sat on a wooden bench against the wall. She ate slowly, making the food last, tasting each component separately. The bread was soft and slightly sweet. The cheese was real, not the ersatz blocks they had been given in the final years of the war. The ham was salty and satisfying. No one took it away. No one said she had eaten enough. No one reduced her portion because of who she was or where she came from. When the break was over, they returned to work. The afternoon passed in the same rhythm as the morning, the same motions repeated until they became automatic. Greta's mind drifted while her hands continued their work, sorting, scrubbing, wringing, hanging. She thought about the camp in Casablanca, about the cold cement floors and the thin soup. She thought about the desert, about the heat and the flies and the constant sound of shelling. She thought about her sister in Hamburg, if she was still alive, if the city was still standing, if there was anything left of the life they had known before. At 4 o'clock, the supervisor signalled the end of the shift. She walked down the rows with a ledger, stopping beside each woman and marking something next to their names. When she reached Greta, she made her mark, said something in English that might have been thanks or dismissal, and moved on. Greta washed her hands one final time, dried them on her shirt, and followed the others back to the barracks. She lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling, feeling the ache in her back and shoulders, the sting of her raw hands. But beneath the physical discomfort was something else, something she had not felt in so long it took her a moment to identify it. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of tentative relief. She had worked, she had been fed. No one had struck her or shouted at her or taken anything from her. The card in her pocket said she would be paid. She did not know if she believed that yet, but the possibility of it, the mere suggestion that her labor had monetary value, was enough to quiet the worst of her fears. That evening, after dinner, she sat on her cot and took out the card again. 80 cents per day. She tried to calculate what that meant, but her mind was too tired to handle the arithmetic. It did not matter. What mattered was the promise, the idea that she was not simply being used but compensated. What mattered was the word itself: wages. The days settled into a pattern. Wake at 6, breakfast, work in the laundry from 8 until 4 with a break at noon, dinner, free time in the evening, sleep. The routine was steady and predictable, without variation but also without surprises. Greta's hands toughened, the skin growing thick and calloused where it had been raw. Her body adjusted to the physical demands of the work, muscles that had atrophied during the long journey now rebuilding themselves. She gained weight, slowly, her ribs no longer so prominent, her face filling out. She spoke little to the other women during those first weeks. Conversation felt dangerous, a potential opening for questions she did not want to answer or memories she did not want to revisit. But silence was its own language, and in the quiet hours of shared labor, she began to recognize the women around her. There was Ilse, thin and nervous, who cried at night but worked with fierce concentration during the day. There was Anna, older and harder, who saved every scrap of food she could hide and spoke to no one. There was Margaret from the ship, who had stopped crying and now moved through the days with a blank expression that frightened Greta more than tears ever could. At the end of the first week, they were assembled in the mess hall after dinner. An officer stood at the front, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses and a crisp uniform. Beside him stood the translator, the same young man who worked in the laundry, his Bavarian accent more pronounced in the larger space. The officer spoke briefly, his tone formal but not harsh. The translator relayed the words in German. Each woman had earned $5.60 for the week of work. The canteen would open the following afternoon. They could purchase toiletries, stationery, small necessities and luxuries. Their account balances would be maintained by the camp administration, and they could check their balances at any time. Greta sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. $5.60. She tried to understand what that meant, what it could buy, but her experience with American currency was non-existent. What mattered was the confirmation that the promise on the card was real. They had been paid. She had been paid. For her work, for her labor, for the hours spent in the hot, humid laundry sorting and scrubbing and wringing. She had not been paid in 3 years. She had not owned money. Real money that she could spend as she chose, since before the war. Around her, other women were reacting with the same stunned silence. Some were crying. Others were smiling with expressions that looked almost painful, as though their faces had forgotten how to form that shape. Ilse was shaking, her thin shoulders trembling as she pressed her hands to her face. Greta reached over and gripped her wrist, and Ilse gripped back, her fingers digging into Greta's skin hard enough to bruise. That night, the barracks hummed with whispered conversations that lasted long into the darkness. Women speculated about what they could buy, what they needed, what they had dreamed about during the long months of captivity. Greta listened but did not join in. She lay on her cot with her hand in her pocket, fingers touching the card, the physical proof that she had value, that her work mattered, that she was not merely an object to be used and discarded when no longer useful. The canteen was housed in a converted storage shed painted white, its door propped open to let in the afternoon breeze. Greta stood at the back of the line of women waiting to enter, her stomach tight with something that might have been anticipation or might have been fear. When her turn finally came, she stepped through the door and stopped, overwhelmed by what she saw. The shelves were stocked with an abundance that seemed impossible. Bars of soap in different colors, wrapped in paper printed with brands she did not recognize. Tubes of toothpaste, bottles of shampoo, packages of writing paper in various sizes. There were pencils, pens, envelopes, stamps. There were hairpins and small mirrors and combs with plastic handles. On the lower shelves, she saw tins of hard candy, packages of biscuits, small jars of jam. A sign behind the counter listed prices in clear black numbers. Soap 25 cents, candy 30 cents, writing paper 15 cents, pencils 5 cents. Greta moved slowly down the aisle, her hand trailing along the edge of the shelf. She had expected nothing. She had imagined being worked until she was no longer useful, then discarded or forgotten or killed. She had not imagined this simple abundance, this store where she could choose what to buy with money she had earned. The woman ahead of her in line purchased a bar of lavender soap and a tin of lemon drops, and when she turned away from the counter, she was smiling, really smiling, her eyes bright with something that looked like joy. Greta stepped forward. The man behind the counter, a civilian with wire-rimmed glasses and thinning hair, looked at her and waited patiently. She pointed to a package of writing paper, cream-colored and bound with string. Then she pointed to a pencil, yellow with a pink eraser. He took them down from the shelf, checked a card he pulled from a box behind the counter, and handed her the items along with a small receipt printed on thin paper. She held them against her chest and walked out into the afternoon light, feeling the weight of them in her hands, solid and real and hers. That night, Greta sat on her cot with the paper in her lap and the pencil between her fingers. The barracks was quiet, most of the women already asleep, a few reading or writing letters by the dim light of the overhead bulbs. She had not written to anyone in 18 months. Her family was somewhere in the occupied territories, beyond any postal route she could imagine. But having the paper, having the pencil, meant she could try. It meant she was still a person who could form words and send them into the world, even if those words never reached their destination. She wrote the date at the top of the page, careful and precise. October 15th, 1945. Then she paused, the pencil hovering above the paper. She did not know what to say. How could she explain where she was, what was happening to her? How could she describe being paid for her labor, being fed real food, being treated with something that resembled decency? Her sister would read such words and think Greta had lost her mind or was being forced to write propaganda. She wrote her mother's name. Then, beneath it, she wrote, "I am safe. I am being treated well. I am working in a camp in America and receiving wages for my labor. They feed us properly. We have clean beds and warm water for washing. I do not know when I will come home, but I am alive and I think of you constantly." She stared at what she had written. The words looked stark on the page, insufficient to convey the strangeness of her situation or the complexity of her feelings about it. She folded the paper and tucked it under her pillow. She would finish it tomorrow or the day after. She would find better words eventually. The work in the laundry continued. Greta learned to anticipate the rhythm of it, the way the loads came in waves, heavy in the morning, lighter in the afternoon. She learned which soaps worked best on which stains, how to spot a damaged sheet before it went through the mangle, how to fold the finished linens into precise, neat stacks. The supervisor rarely spoke directly to the German workers, but she was not unkind. When Greta struggled with a particularly stubborn blood stain, the supervisor came over and showed her how to treat it with cold water and a special powder, demonstrating the technique with patient, economical gestures. In the second week, Greta and a few other women were assigned additional duty in the kitchens during the afternoon shift. They peeled potatoes and carrots, chopped onions until their eyes streamed, washed dishes in sinks filled with water hot enough to redden their skin. The cook, A broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and flour dusted across his apron spoke a little German picked up from previous groups of prisoners. He told jokes that made no sense until someone translated, usually badly, and he laughed at his own humor with a deep, rolling sound that filled the kitchen. He never raised his voice except to be heard over the clatter of pots and pans, and at the end of each shift he handed out rolls still warm from the oven, telling them in his broken German to take, to eat, that there was always more. Greta's second paycheck came at the end of the second week, $5.60 again. She returned to the canteen with her earnings and stood in front of the shelves for a long time, considering her options. Finally, she chose a small notebook bound in brown cloth, a handkerchief with flowers embroidered in one corner, and a tin of peaches in syrup. The peaches cost 50 cents, a luxury, but she wanted them with an intensity that surprised her. That evening, she sat on her cot and opened the tin with the small key attached to the lid. The scent of the syrup rose up, sweet and almost overwhelming. She used her spoon to lift out one slice, golden and perfectly formed, and placed it in her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue, sugar and fruit, and something that reminded her of summers before the war, of her mother's kitchen, of a world that no longer existed. She ate the peaches slowly, one slice at a time, savoring each bite, letting the syrup coat her throat. When the tin was empty, she washed it carefully and used it to store her small treasures, the handkerchief, a spare pencil, the receipts from her canteen purchases. The other women began to talk more openly about what they would buy when they had saved enough. Ilse wanted a wool scarf, red or blue, something bright and warm. Anna was hoarding her wages in a small cloth pouch she kept under her mattress, refusing to spend anything, saving for something she would not name. Margaret bought writing paper and stamps every week, composing letters to an address in Berlin that might no longer exist, sending them out with a determination that bordered on desperation. A woman named Frida purchased a small mirror and spent her evenings examining her reflection, touching the hollows of her cheeks, the lines that had appeared around her eyes, trying to reconcile the face she saw with the face she remembered. Greta listened to their plans and felt something unfurl in her chest, something that might have been hope but was quieter, more cautious. She had learned not to trust comfort. She had learned that kindness could be withdrawn without warning, that small mercies could be preludes to greater cruelties. But the wages kept coming, the canteen kept opening. The work continued, steady and predictable, and no one told them it would end. One afternoon in late autumn, Greta was folding linens in the laundry when the supervisor approached with a small envelope in her hand. She held it out to Greta, pointing to the name written on the front in careful block letters. Greta took it, confused. She had not expected mail. She had not believed anyone knew where she was, or that letters could reach this place. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers, tearing the paper slightly in her haste. Inside was a single sheet, thin and covered in cramped handwriting she recognized immediately as her younger sister's. The ink was smudged in places, the words sometimes illegible, but the message was clear. Her family was alive. Her mother, her sister, her younger brother. They were in Hamburg. They were struggling, food was scarce, and work was hard to find, but they were alive. Her sister wrote that she had received Greta's letter through the Red Cross, forwarded through channels that had taken months. She wrote that she could not believe what Greta had described, the wages and the food and the treatment, that she hoped it was true and not some fabrication required by the camp authorities. Greta read the letter 3 times, then a 4th, until she had memorized every word. Then she pressed it against her chest and wept, her shoulders shaking, tears running down her face and dripping onto the folded linens in front of her. The supervisor glanced over, said something soft in English that might have been sympathy or might have been a simple acknowledgement, and left her alone. When Greta finally composed herself, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket with the card that promised wages. That evening, she went to the canteen and bought a second package of writing paper, this one larger and of better quality. She sat on her cot under the single bulb that lit the barracks and wrote a long letter to her sister, describing the camp in detail. She described the work, the laundry and the kitchens, the rhythm of the days. She described the wages, the exact amount, the way it was recorded and paid. She described the canteen, the shelves stocked with soap and candy and writing paper. She described the tin of peaches, the taste of them, the way they had reminded her of home. She described the barracks, the clean cots and wool blankets. She described the food, the chicken and bread and butter, the coffee that was bitter but plentiful. She knew it sounded impossible. She knew her sister would read it and wonder if she was lying, if the letter had been censored or coerced, if this was propaganda designed for some purpose Greta could not fathom. But it was the truth. Every word of it was the truth. She sealed the envelope and wrote her sister's address on the front, hoping it was still valid, hoping the city still existed in some form that allowed for mail delivery. The next morning, she handed it to the mail clerk, a young private who accepted it without comment and stamped it with a heavy metal device that left an official mark in black ink. The seasons turned. The heat of summer gave way to the milder temperatures of autumn, then to the first cold snaps of early winter. The camp administration distributed heavier coats and additional blankets. The mess hall began serving soups and stews instead of the lighter fare of summer, thick with meat and vegetables and potatoes. Greta gained more weight. Her face filled out. Her arms developed muscle from the constant work. She no longer looked like a prisoner, at least not the kind she had imagined. She looked like a worker, someone engaged in productive labor, someone who was fed and clothed and compensated for her efforts. The medical officer began making weekly rounds through the barracks, checking for illness, distributing aspirin and bandages. He was an older man, calm and methodical, speaking through the translator who accompanied him. When Greta mentioned the toothache that had been bothering her for months, he made a note and told her a dentist would be available the following week. She had not expected that. She had assumed her teeth would rot slowly. That pain would simply be something to endure until it became unbearable or resolved itself through extraction or infection. The dentist arrived as promised, setting up a makeshift clinic in a side building that smelled of antiseptic and cotton. When Greta's name was called, she entered with the same apprehension she would have felt entering an interrogation room. But the dentist, a middle-aged man with gentle hands and wire-rimmed glasses, simply gestured for her to sit in the chair. His assistant, a young woman with kind eyes, translated his questions. Where did it hurt? How long had it been bothering her? Could she point to the exact tooth? Greta answered, and the dentist examined her mouth with a small mirror and a bright light. He found the cavity quickly, a dark spot on one of her lower molars. He explained through the translator that he would fill it, that it would hurt a little but not much, that she should try to relax. He swabbed her gum with something cold and bitter that made her tongue go numb, then worked quickly and efficiently, drilling out the decay and filling the cavity with a paste that hardened under his tools. When he finished, he gave her a small mirror so she could see the repaired tooth, a silver filling that gleamed dully in the light. She touched her jaw, feeling the absence of pain for the first time in months, and thanked him in halting English. He nodded and waved her toward the door, already calling the next name. By midwinter, Greta had saved $23. The amount seemed enormous, incomprehensible. She could buy soap and candy and writing paper whenever she wanted. She could purchase luxuries she had not even imagined wanting. She bought a pair of woolen socks, thick and soft, warmer than anything she had owned in years. She bought a bar of chocolate, dark and bitter, and ate one square each evening, letting it melt on her tongue while she lay on her cot and listened to the wind outside. She bought a small comb with a tortoiseshell handle, replacing the broken plastic one she had been using. Ilsa bought her red scarf and wore it constantly, wrapped around her neck even indoors, the wool bright against the grey of her work clothes. Anna continued to save, her cloth pouch growing heavier, the coins inside clinking softly when she moved it. Margaret's letters continued going out week after week, a steady stream of words sent into the unknown. A woman named Helena bought a small bottle of perfume, rose-scented, and dabbed it on her wrists before dinner, the fragrance drifting through the barracks like a memory of something beautiful and lost. In the spring, the camp administration announced additional work opportunities. Volunteers were needed for the gardens, for extra shifts in the mess hall, for a new laundry facility being built on the western edge of the compound. The pay would be increased for these extra shifts, an additional 50 cents per day. Greta signed up for the gardens immediately, eager to work outside after months indoors. The soil was dark and rich, smelling of thawed earth and composted manure. She knelt in the dirt and felt the sun warm her back, the breeze cool on her face. They planted rows of beans and tomatoes, carrots and lettuce, herbs whose names she did not know but whose scents were green and alive. The work was backbreaking, hours spent bent over with a trowel or hoe, her hands caked with dirt, her knees sinking into the soft ground. But it was different from the laundry, less confining, more connected to something that felt real and vital. She could see the results of her labor, the small green shoots pushing up through the soil, reaching toward the light. She worked beside women she had barely spoken to during the winter months, their silence comfortable, their movements synchronized. The supervisor, a wiry man with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands, spoke no German but communicated through gesture and example. He showed them how to thin the seedlings, how to stake the tomato plants, how to recognize the difference between weeds and the vegetables they were trying to grow. At the end of each shift, he handed each of them an extra $1 and sometimes a basket of whatever was ready for harvest. Strawberries in late spring, small and sweet and still warm from the sun. Early lettuce, crisp and green. Radishes, peppery and bright. Greta ate 3 strawberries on the walk back to the barracks, the juice staining her fingers red. She saved the rest for the other women, setting them out on a plate in the center of the barracks, a small offering that disappeared in minutes. The letters from her sister came more regularly now, arriving every few weeks with Hamburg postmarks and increasingly optimistic reports. The city was rebuilding. Food was still scarce, but improving. Her brother had found work with a British construction crew. Her mother was managing a small vegetable plot in the ruins of what had been their neighbor's garden. Her sister asked when Greta would come home, each letter more insistent than the last. Greta did not know how to answer. She did not know if she wanted to go home. Home was rubble and hunger and a future that felt like a closing door. Here she had work, she had wages, she had a cot and a blanket and a tin of peaches when she wanted it. She had a space that was hers, small and circumscribed, but hers nonetheless. She had become accustomed to the routine, to the predictability, to the strange dignity of being paid for her labor. The thought of leaving that, of returning to a destroyed country with no infrastructure and no opportunities, filled her with something close to dread. She folded her sister's letters and kept them in her notebook, a growing stack of paper that smelled faintly of ink and distance. One warm evening in early summer, the women were assembled in the mess hall for a film screening. A small projector had been set up on a table at the front of the room, the reels already loaded, the screen hung against the far wall. Greta sat with Ilse and Margaret, curious about what they would be shown. She expected propaganda, some film designed to demonstrate American superiority or German defeat. Instead, the lights dimmed and the projector began to whir, and the screen filled with images of cowboys and horses and vast desert landscapes. The film was a western, all dust and shootouts and men in wide-brimmed hats speaking English too fast for Greta to follow. But the images needed no translation. The sweep of the landscape, the drama of the chase, the simple morality of good against evil. It was escapism, pure and uncomplicated, and Greta found herself drawn into it despite herself. Beside her, Ilse laughed at something a cowboy did, a genuine sound of delight that Greta had not heard from her before. When the film ended and the lights came up, the women filed out slowly, talking quietly among themselves, the mood lighter than it had been in months. Greta walked back to the barracks under a sky full of stars, bright and sharp against the darkness. She thought about the film, about the simplicity of its story, about the way it had allowed her to forget, for an hour, where she was and what she was. She thought about the strangeness of being a prisoner who was paid, who was fed, who was entertained. She thought about the impossibility of explaining any of this to someone who had not experienced it. By midsummer, she had saved $41. She used some of it to buy a notebook bound in green cloth, more expensive than her previous ones, but beautiful in a way that seemed almost frivolous. She bought a fountain pen and a small bottle of ink, dark blue and slightly scented. She began writing more than letters. She wrote about the work, about the laundry and the kitchens and the gardens. She wrote about the women she lived with, their faces and voices and small habits. She wrote about the taste of peaches and the smell of lavender soap and the weight of woolen socks. She wrote about the wages, about the canteen, about the quiet dignity of being able to choose what she purchased, what she kept, what she gave away. She wrote because she needed to remember that this had happened, that it was real, that she had not imagined it. She wrote because she did not know if anyone outside the camp would believe it, and she needed proof, something tangible she could hold in her hand. She wrote because the act of writing made her feel human, made her feel like someone whose experiences mattered, whose thoughts were worth recording. The war ended in August. The news reached the camp slowly, filtered through official channels and whispered conversations. Greta learned of the final surrender on a Tuesday morning, standing in the laundry with her hands submerged in soapy water. The supervisor came in and spoke briefly to the translator, who turned to the women and relayed the information in German. The war was over, unconditionally. The regime had fallen. The country had surrendered completely. The women stood in silence, unsure how to react. Relief and fear mingled in equal measure. Greta wrung out a sheet and hung it on the line, her hands moving automatically. She did not know what came next. She did not know if she would be sent home or kept here or moved somewhere else. She did not know if the war being over meant she was free or simply that her status had changed from prisoner of war to something else, something undefined and uncertain. She finished her shift and returned to the barracks, lying on her cot and staring at the ceiling. Around her, other women were crying or praying or simply sitting in stunned silence. Ilse was clutching her red scarf, her fingers working the wool compulsively. Anna was counting the money in her pouch, the coins making small clicking sounds as she stacked and restacked them. Margaret was writing another letter, her hand moving across the page with mechanical precision. The days after the surrender were strange and quiet. The work continued, but the atmosphere shifted, a sense of waiting settling over the camp like a heavy blanket. Greta kept going to the laundry, kept earning her wages, kept buying small things at the canteen. She bought a bar of soap that smelled like lemons. She bought a package of biscuits and shared them with the women in her barracks. She bought a tube of hand cream that smelled of roses and felt luxurious and unnecessary and perfect. She wrote letters to her sister, telling her the war was over, telling her she did not yet know when she would come home. She wrote about her mixed feelings, about not wanting to leave this place where she was treated with decency, about fearing the return to a destroyed country with an uncertain future. She knew her sister would not understand. She knew anyone reading her words would think she had lost her mind or been brainwashed. But it was the truth. In September, the camp administration made an announcement. The women would be repatriated in stages, beginning in November. Priority would be given to those with families waiting for them, to those with specific destinations. The process would take months. They should prepare themselves. Greta listened to the announcement and felt nothing, a numbness that spread through her chest and settled in her limbs. She had spent over a year in this camp. She had earned wages. She had bought peaches and soap and writing paper. She had been treated with a decency she had not expected, had not believed possible. She did not want to leave. She did not want to return to Hamburg, to the rubble and the hunger and the shame of defeat. but she had no choice. The decision had been made by people she would never meet, in offices she could not imagine. That evening, she went to the canteen and bought a small American flag on a stick, the kind children waved at parades. She did not know why she bought it. Perhaps as a memento, perhaps as proof, perhaps because she wanted something that represented this place, this strange interlude where she had been a prisoner and yet had been treated with dignity. The night before her departure, scheduled for early December, Greta counted the money she had saved, $53.40. She had spent some on small purchases, sent some home in packages when the opportunity arose, but kept most of it, folded in an envelope she kept in her footlocker. She placed the envelope in the bottom of her bag, beneath her spare clothes and the green notebook and the letters from her sister. She lay on her cot for the last time, the wool blanket pulled up to her chin, and listened to the breathing of the women around her. Ilsa was asleep in the next cot, the red scarf draped over the footboard. Anna was awake, staring at the ceiling, her hands folded on her chest. Margaret was writing one final letter, her pen scratching softly against the paper. Greta closed her eyes and tried to remember what home felt like. But all she could summon was the smell of disinfectant and starch, the taste of peaches, the weight of coins in her hand. She tried to imagine Hamburg, but the city in her mind was a ghost, a shadow of what it had been. She tried to imagine seeing her family again, but their faces were blurred and indistinct, as though she had been away for decades rather than years. She slept fitfully, waking several times to check the small clock mounted on the wall near the door. Each time, she felt a fresh wave of anxiety mixed with something that might have been grief. She was leaving safety. She was leaving wages and clean water and regular meals. She was leaving a place where she had been treated as though she mattered. The bus came at dawn, a military vehicle with hard seats and windows that fogged with condensation in the cold morning air. Greta climbed aboard with her bag slung over her shoulder, the envelope of money pressing against her side through the fabric. She found a seat near the back and looked out the window as the camp receded, the barracks and the mess hall and the canteen growing smaller until they disappeared entirely. She thought about the card she had been given on her first day, the words printed in German, the promise it had made. You will receive 80 cents per day for work performed. She had not believed it then. She believed it now. The journey home took weeks, a series of trains and trucks and temporary shelters. Greta travelled with a group of women she barely knew, their conversations muted and cautious. They spoke little about the camp, about the wages, about the canteen. It felt too fragile, too strange to share with anyone who had not been there. When someone asked what it had been like, Greta said only that it had been better than expected and let the silence fill in the rest. The landscape changed slowly, becoming more familiar and yet somehow more foreign. The flat expanse of America gave way to the ocean crossing, then to the bombed ports of northern Europe, then to the cratered roads and ruined cities of Germany itself. Each mile brought her closer to home and further from the place where she had been safe. When she finally reached Hamburg in late December, the city was almost unrecognizable. Whole blocks had been reduced to rubble, the streets filled with people who moved like ghosts through the ruins. She found her sister's building by memory, picking her way through debris and frozen mud, climbing stairs that creaked ominously under her weight. She knocked on a door that was cracked and patched with scrap wood, and her sister opened it. They stood looking at each other for a long moment, neither speaking. Her sister was older, thinner, her face lined with exhaustion and hunger. But her eyes were bright, and when she pulled Greta inside, her embrace was fierce and desperate. The apartment was small and cold, heated by a single stove that burned scavenged wood. Her mother was there, and her brother, both of them older and worn but alive. They sat at the small table and cried together, the sound filling the cramped space. That night, after they had eaten the meagre dinner her sister had prepared, Greta took out the envelope. She counted the money on the table, the bills worn and creased but still intact. $53.40. Her sister stared at the pile, then looked up at Greta, her eyes wide with something between disbelief and wonder. Greta told them about the camp. She told them about the work, about the laundry and the kitchens and the gardens. She told them about the wages, about the canteen, about buying peaches and soap and writing paper. She told them about being paid for her labor, about being treated as though she still mattered, as though she were still human. She told them about the dentist who had fixed her tooth, about the medical officer who had distributed aspirin, about the cook who had given them warm rolls at the end of each shift. She told them about the film screening, about the Western with its cowboys and horses and simple morality. Her family listened in silence, their expressions shifting from skepticism to confusion to something that might have been belief. When Greta finished, her sister reached across the table and took her hand. They sat together, the money between them, the room cold and dim, but filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. In the weeks that followed, Greta used her savings carefully. She bought food on the black market, real food that supplemented the meager rations. She bought medicine for her mother, who had developed a persistent cough. She bought fabric so her sister could make new clothes to replace the rags they were wearing. She bought coal for the stove, precious and expensive but necessary to survive the winter. She found work eventually, in a factory that paid very little but paid something. She worked long hours in conditions that made the laundry seem luxurious, standing at a machine that stamped metal parts for rebuilding projects she would never see completed. The pay was irregular, the treatment indifferent at best, hostile at worst. No one thanked her for her work. No one handed her warm rolls or gave her extra vegetables from the garden. No one paid her wages that allowed her to buy small